Hey there, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments.
You know that moment when someone tells you to get lost and it echoes in your bones? It doesn't feel like yelling or anger or even rejection. It feels like something being ripped from your chest, like your entire identity has just been wiped away with a single sentence. That's what it felt like when my father looked me dead in the eye, standing in the middle of his kitchen, and said, "You're a disappointment. Maybe it's time you found somewhere else to be." He didn't yell. He didn't even look angry, just tired, like I was a burden he'd been carrying too long, like he'd finally given himself permission to let go. And what made it worse, what made my fingers go cold and my eyes blur up, was how calm he was about it, like it wasn't even personal, just something overdue. I stood there holding a coffee cup I hadn't even taken a sip from, the steam still rising in front of my face. For a second, I thought maybe I'd misheard him. But then he turned his back to me and went back to slicing an apple, like I hadn't just been told to pack up my entire life and get lost. I didn't say anything. I didn't scream or throw anything or demand he take it back. That might have been easier, honestly. That would have felt more like a fight, more like something we could recover from. But this was different. This was final, like he'd already decided. And I knew from growing up with him that once he closed a door, it didn't open again without a hell of a fight. So I did what I always did when it came to my dad. I made myself small and disappeared. It took me less than an hour to pack. I'd never really moved in, not fully. I'd come back a year ago after my divorce, thinking I'd just be here for a few months while I got my feet under me again. But a few months turned into a year, then into maybe I'll just help around here for a while, and then into, well, apparently into being the family disappointment. I folded my clothes neatly, zipped up the single suitcase I'd brought when I first arrived, and grabbed the charger from the wall like I wouldn't be back. It was almost laughable how little I had accumulated. You'd think after a year of being somewhere there'd be more to pack, but there wasn't. Just a toothbrush, a couple of worn-out books, and the old laptop I used to freelance and keep the bills paid. My dad didn't even come upstairs while I was packing. I heard the TV click on in the living room, and the dull roar of a baseball game filled the house like background noise. That made it easier, in a weird way. It's hard to cry when someone's ignoring you that thoroughly. It's like your body just accepts it, goes numb, protects itself the only way it knows how. I didn't cry when I zipped up the suitcase. I didn't cry when I loaded it into my car, but I did cry once I got to the end of the driveway and stopped. Just sat there with the car idling, looking back at the house like it was some kind of monument to all the ways I'd tried to be good enough. The thing is, I'd been paying their mortgage, quietly, automatically. I'd set it up a few months into living there when I overheard my mom crying on the phone about being behind on bills. I hadn't told them. It felt like something I could do without making it a whole thing. I didn't want thanks. I just wanted them to breathe a little easier. It wasn't even a huge amount every month, but it helped. They never asked how the bills were getting paid, and I never brought it up. And in a way, that arrangement worked for everyone, until he told me to leave. I pulled over in a Walgreens parking lot, opened my laptop, and logged into the autopay dashboard. There was the mortgage, like clockwork, drafted every first of the month. I stared at it for a long time, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to remember the moment. The second I stopped making life easier for someone who had just decided I wasn't worth keeping around. I hovered over the cancel button, and before I could talk myself out of it, I clicked. That was it. No confirmation email, no thank you, just silence. And that silence followed me for the rest of the day. I crashed on my friend Tara's couch, the same one she used to let me sleep on when we were broke 20-somethings just trying to survive. She didn't ask questions, just handed me a beer, tossed me a blanket, and said, "You're staying as long as you need. No rent, no nonsense." I nodded and took a sip, trying to push down the guilt crawling up my throat. Not for leaving, but for still hoping, somewhere deep down, that my phone would buzz with a message that said, "Come back, I didn't mean it." But it never did. I fell asleep listening to the buzz of city traffic and the soft snore of Tara's pit bull at my feet. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to earn my space. I didn't feel like a tenant in my own life. The next morning, my dad's mortgage payment bounced. I knew because I got the notification, even though I'd turned off the autopay. And that's when the real fallout started. But that's a story for tomorrow. It's a strange thing, really, to be someone's child well into adulthood and still find yourself flinching under their disappointment like a grade schooler who brought home a bad report card. Especially when you've crossed every T and dotted every I in the life they said they wanted for you, only to discover that somehow your very presence still feels like a burden to them. Sitting on Tara's couch, one foot resting on the armrest like I was 17 again, I stared at the soft glow of my laptop screen, watching the spinning circle confirm the one action that felt both irreversible and, for once, entirely mine. I had clicked cancel on the autopay linked to their mortgage, and in doing so, I hadn't just disrupted a financial system. I'd severed something quieter but deeper, like I'd finally stood up in the courtroom of our relationship and said, I'm not going to plead guilty anymore for simply existing. The weight of what I'd done didn't hit all at once. At first, it was just numbers disappearing from a schedule, a line item wiped clean. I sat there for a long time, maybe 40 minutes or more, with my fingers hovering uselessly above the keyboard, not knowing if I felt triumphant or terrified. Tara walked in from the tiny galley kitchen with a bowl of cereal in hand, dry because she never had milk in the house, and raised an eyebrow in that way only she could, biting off a mouthful of bran flakes and chewing like it was a quiet protest. You look like you just defunded the Pentagon, she said around a mouthful, her eyes flicking toward the screen. You okay? I didn't respond right away, mostly because I wasn't sure how to explain that I'd just, very calmly and very deliberately, cut off the one quiet lifeline that had kept my parents' house afloat for the past 10 months. Instead, I leaned back into the couch and let out a slow breath that felt like it had been trapped somewhere behind my ribs since the night before. My dad told me to find somewhere else to be, I said, and the words hung in the air like the smell of burned toast. Sharp, intrusive, hard to ignore. So I did, and then I canceled the mortgage payments. That got her attention. Tara set the bowl down on the coffee table with a soft thunk and stared at me with a look that was part horror, part admiration. Holy hell, Jess, you just nuked their financial life. I nodded, not because I was proud, but because for the first time in what felt like months, I had done something for myself that wasn't laced with guilt or second-guessing. I had been trying so hard to help without being asked, to fix what they wouldn't acknowledge was broken. And all I got for it was the boot. I didn't owe them silence anymore. The rest of the day passed in a haze, the kind that makes you forget what time it is or whether you've eaten. I answered a few emails from freelance clients, half-heartedly responded to a follow-up about a content strategy job that might pay decently if it ever materialized, and ignored 3 calls from a number I knew belonged to my father. I didn't want to hear his voice, not yet. I wasn't ready to find out whether it was angry, scared, or worse. Calm, like I had never mattered enough to rattle him in the first place. Late in the afternoon, Tara's neighbor dropped by with a bag of groceries and a story about someone stealing Amazon packages off her porch, and I stood there smiling politely while my brain ran in circles around the same question. What happens now? Because there's a certain kind of quiet after an explosion, a waiting period where nothing quite moves, and I could feel myself trapped in that stillness, but I knew the fallout was coming. You don't pull the financial rug out from under a man like my father without a ripple effect. The only question was how loud it would be. And sure enough, the next morning, it started. I was brushing my teeth in Tara's bathroom, one of those cramped spaces with toothpaste specks on the mirror and a stack of worn magazines by the toilet, when I heard my phone buzz 4 times in a row. No voicemails, just texts. The first was from my brother, who hadn't texted me in 3 months. The message was short and unsurprisingly on brand. What the hell did you do? The second was from my mother. Jess, your father is very upset. He's trying to keep calm, but he says the mortgage didn't go through. Please call him. That one hit a little harder. My mom was always the buffer, the soft voice between my dad's rigid expectations and my constant need to apologize for falling short. I could almost hear the careful phrasing in her text, like she was trying to build a bridge out of matchsticks. But I didn't call, not yet. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared out at the tiny patch of sky visible between the cracked blinds in Tara's guest room, wondering how long it would take before the real storm hit. I was expecting rage, shouting, maybe even threats. I wasn't expecting silence. The silence came that afternoon, in the form of my father driving by Tara's apartment. I saw the truck out the window, a beat-up blue-silver auto with a faulty-rusting tailgate and one of those old faded bumper stickers that said, "Proud Union Dad." He didn't come up. He just sat there, engine idling, parked across the street like he was staking out a scene, trying to decide whether or not to enter enemy territory. I watched from behind the curtain, holding my breath, half hoping he'd storm up the stairs and demand an explanation, and half terrified that he would. But he didn't. He just sat there for maybe 10 minutes, then drove off. No messages, no voicemails, just that truck, sitting like a question mark outside my borrowed home. And that's when I knew, for all the noise he'd made about disappointment, about me not belonging, he had never imagined a version of our life where I'd actually leave, let alone pull the financial plug on what kept his world standing. He didn't know what to do with that. And honestly, neither did I, but I was starting to figure it out. And the best part was, I wasn't doing it from under his roof anymore. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles into the soul when you realize someone expected you to fall apart without them. And yet, here you are, standing, breathing, moving forward, no longer orbiting the gravitational pull of their disappointment. That quiet doesn't bring peace exactly, but it carries a clarity that slices through all the years of playing small, of over-explaining, of taking on guilt, like it was some inherited family debt you were born owing. That was the quiet I sat with as I watched my father's truck vanish down the block, his taillights blinking like some weak echo of authority he no longer had over me. He had driven by without knocking, without yelling, without even calling again, and in that absence I saw it clearly. He didn't know how to handle losing the upper hand. The next morning the silence broke, not with a bang, but with a vibration. 5 missed calls and 2 voicemails, both from my younger sister Lindsay, who, unlike my brother, was usually too busy with her own 2 kids and on-again, off-again fiancé to ever get involved in family drama unless it spilled into her living room. Her voice, though strained, still carried that practiced politeness we were all raised on, the kind that said, "I'm not taking sides," while desperately trying to avoid becoming the next target. She said she wasn't sure what had happened, only that Dad was acting strange, barely speaking to Mom, walking around the house like a man waiting for a hammer to fall, and that Mom was really shaken up, which, in our family, was code for crying in the laundry room and pretending it's just allergies. I didn't respond right away. I just played the message back a few times, not because I needed to hear the words again, but because I needed to sit with the reality of them. This ripple I'd caused, this quiet collapse unfolding in a house I'd grown up in, but never truly belonged to. There was no pleasure in knowing they were struggling, no glee in imagining my father fuming at the kitchen table as he tried to figure out how to cover the next mortgage payment. But there was something else, something steadier, colder, and more complicated than revenge. It was the satisfaction of no longer pretending that my presence was without value. He had always made it clear that love, in our house, came with strings attached. Do well, speak less, need nothing. So when I gave without asking, paid the bills without fanfare, showed up day after day trying to keep peace in a house that confused silence for stability, I was, in his eyes, just doing the bare minimum to stay in the good graces of a system I was never meant to challenge. And when I pulled that support, quietly, cleanly, he didn't know how to respond, because I hadn't made a scene. I hadn't begged to stay. I had simply stopped giving. That afternoon, I ran into an old neighbor from back home at the grocery store. Her name was Mrs. Halloway, and she was the kind of woman who always smelled like cinnamon gum and called everyone honey, whether she liked them or not. She spotted me near the self-checkout lane and did a full double take. her eyes scanning me up and down like I was a ghost. "Jessica Lynn, what on earth are you doing out here? Your mama said you were just taking some space, but I figured you'd be back by now." I offered the tightest smile I could manage and said something vague about working remotely for a while, but her expression told me she wasn't buying it. She stepped in a little closer, voice dropping into that conspiratorial whisper people use when they're pretending to be kind, but are really just digging for dirt. "Your daddy's been walking around like someone kicked his dog. Something about the bank calling. You know anything about that?" I shrugged and grabbed my receipt, trying not to roll my eyes. "I guess sometimes banks call when people stop paying their mortgage." Her mouth opened just enough for a shocked gasp, but I didn't stick around to hear her response. I walked out of the store with my head high, my stomach doing flips, and a strange buzzing behind my eyes like maybe, just maybe, I was finally tipping the scale in my own favor. Back at Tara's place, I found her sitting on the floor, surrounded by open delivery boxes and half-assembled bookshelves. She was reorganizing her studio for the third time that year and greeted me with a look that only best friends can give, equal parts exasperated and amused. "You've got neighborhood drama trailing behind you like it's an episode of Dateline," she said, balancing a shelf plank on one knee. "Is this what suburban exile looks like?" I flopped down beside her and let out a low laugh that felt good in my chest. "It's quieter than I expected," I said, "but somehow louder too." We spent the evening assembling furniture and talking about nothing important. Boys we almost dated, clients who ghosted us, shows we both pretended not to binge watch alone, and somewhere between the Allen wrench and the missing screws, I realized something I hadn't let myself say out loud. I wasn't just staying away out of anger. I was staying away because, for the first time in years, I felt like myself without apology. That night, as I lay on the futon, under a half-washed blanket with a spring poking through the edge, I let my phone ring twice before silencing it. My father had finally called. Not a text, not a message through my mom or siblings, but a real call. I didn't answer, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I needed him to sit with the silence the way I had. I needed him to feel the weight of what it meant when someone you depend on stops showing up just because you decided they weren't good enough. I closed my eyes and listened to the soft hum of the city outside, the muffled arguments from the upstairs neighbors, and the faint tapping of rain against the fire escape. It wasn't peace exactly, but it was mine. And I was no longer trading my worth for a place at a table that had always made me feel like a guest in my own family. Whatever came next, I was ready, because the collapse had already started. And this time, I wasn't the one being buried. It had been just over a week since I left my parents' house, though in the strange liminal space I now existed in, that time felt stretched and warped, like an elastic band pulled too tight, moments blending into each other with the strange clarity of people living on the edge of something about to give. I'd started waking up before my alarm without meaning to, eyes snapping open to unfamiliar light streaming through Tara's dusty blinds, heart already thudding with a restless energy I couldn't quite name, like my body knew, long before my mind did, that we weren't out of the woods yet, that something was still looming on the horizon and simply hadn't shown its face yet. That morning, it did. It was a Tuesday, mid-morning, the kind of day where nothing particularly dramatic should have happened, when I saw his truck again. I was halfway through microwaving leftovers when I caught a flash of that same beat-up blue Silverado rolling past the apartment building, its unmistakable rattle and the crooked rearview mirror hanging like a memory I hadn't invited. I didn't move right away. I let the hum of the microwave fill the silence, hands gripping the edge of the counter as if bracing for an aftershock. Because it wasn't just a visit anymore. This was a stakeout. He parked this time, didn't just idle or drive slowly like he had before, but actually killed the engine and sat there, unmoving, as if waiting for something to come and claim him. I could see the top of his head just above the steering wheel, the familiar tilt of his posture that screamed stubbornness and refusal to budge. I knew that pose. I had lived under the weight of it for over 30 years. When the knock finally came, it wasn't loud, just firm. I almost laughed, not because anything about it was funny, but because I had spent the better part of my adult life imagining what it would be like if he ever came to me for something instead of summoning me like a reluctant employee. I opened the door slowly, quietly, like stepping onto a stage. Except this time, I wasn't the one being auditioned. I was the one holding the script. He didn't look good. That was the first thing I noticed. He looked like a man who hadn't slept much, whose pride had taken a hit, bigger than his anger could quite handle. His face was paler than usual, mouth pressed into a line so thin it looked carved there, and his hands, those hands that had built so much in our home over the years, were clenched tightly at his sides as though holding back words or fists, or maybe just holding himself together. "I need to talk to you," he said, the gravel in his voice deeper than usual, weighted by something unfamiliar. Not rage, but something adjacent. Panic, maybe, or fear dressed up in formality. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, letting the silence stretch just long enough to shift the power in the room, or in this case, the doorway. "About the mortgage?" I asked, tone even, not mocking, but with just enough edge to remind him that I wasn't here to comfort or reassure. He didn't answer immediately, which told me more than if he had. He looked past me into the apartment, eyes flicking toward the cluttered shelves and hand-me-down furniture, like he couldn't believe I was actually living here, like he thought this was temporary, a tantrum, something I'd snap out of the minute I missed home-cooked meals and a roof I didn't have to share with someone else's dog hair. "I didn't know you were the one paying it," he finally said, voice low, almost begrudging. That sentence landed like a brick, not because I needed the credit, but because of how much it said about him, about what he'd assumed, what he'd allowed himself to ignore while taking the benefits of someone else's labor. It wasn't the kind of thing you say to mend fences. It was the kind of thing you say when the walls have already crumbled and you're trying to sift through the rubble without admitting you helped cause the collapse. I nodded, then stepped aside. Not an invitation, just a quiet signal that I was willing to let him speak if he could handle hearing what I had to say. He didn't sit down, he just stood there, awkward and still, like the air inside the apartment was different from what he was used to breathing. Too dense with history, too heavy with consequence. "I didn't think it was your responsibility," he said after a long silence. "That's funny," I replied, not smiling. "Because I did." And just like that, the floor shifted again. I told him, calmly, clearly, that I'd been covering the payment since February, that I'd never expected recognition, only a modicum of respect, maybe a little stability for Mom, maybe a roof that didn't need patching every other month. I explained how I'd handled the autopay, how I'd checked the statements, how I had quietly carried a burden he hadn't even realized existed. And when I saw the flicker of confusion cross his face, genuine confusion, as if the very idea of me being capable of something that mattered was foreign to him, it didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It just clarified everything. "I'm not asking you to thank me," I told him. "But you don't get to push me out and keep my money. That's not how this works." He looked like he wanted to argue, to correct something, maybe to reclaim the ground I'd just taken. But instead he sat down slowly in the old chair by the wall, the one Tara used to throw coats over, and put his head in his hands. No yelling, no posturing, just a man realizing, maybe for the first time, that the rules had changed, and he no longer got to decide who played what part. "You can keep the house," I said, standing above him now, "but you're going to have to figure out how to keep it without me." And with that, I walked back into the kitchen, poured myself a cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm on the counter, and let the silence speak for me. He didn't follow. He didn't argue. He sat there for a few more minutes, then got up and left without a word. And that, in the end, said everything. There's a particular kind of quiet that follows a confrontation when no one walks away entirely satisfied. A stillness that clings not because there was resolution, but because there wasn't, and because some part of you knows there never will be. After my father left Tara's apartment that day, shoulders slumped, hands trembling in a way I had never seen before, as if the very act of sitting in a room where he no longer held control had aged him overnight. I thought I might feel something close to triumph, something sharp and validating and long overdue. But what I felt instead was a strange and weighty kind of sadness, not for him exactly, but for the version of myself that had stayed so long hoping he would become something he never promised to be. In the days that followed, I didn't hear from him, not a call, not a text, not even a second-hand update through the family grapevine. And that silence, once again, said everything. He wasn't punishing me, I don't think, nor was he testing the waters of reconciliation. He was simply recoiling, folding into himself like a man who had lost a battle he never knew he was fighting. And rather than ask what came next, he chose to pretend the fight had never happened at all. My mother called, of course, because she always did when things slipped too far out of balance. Her voice, as always, was careful, every word dipped in sugar and sidelong meanings, trying to bridge gaps with polite suggestion rather than directness. She asked if I was well, if Tara's place was too cramped, if maybe I could stop by sometime, not for dinner, just to say hello, maybe to check on the mail or see if I had left anything important behind. I told her I was fine, that Tara's place was small but honest, and that I had everything I needed right where I was. I didn't ask about my father, and she didn't offer. It was around that time I started to understand that not all battles end with a clear winner. Some end with an empty room, a closed door, and a truth too heavy to lift. And maybe that was what this had been all along. Not a fight for control, but a long, slow excavation of who I had become, after years of bending to make someone else more comfortable. A week later, I did something I hadn't done in months. I took the long way home. Not home to the house I'd left, but to the part of town that used to feel like mine, back before I moved in with them, back before I let survival masquerade as submission. I drove past the park where I used to run on cold mornings, past the corner bakery with the chalkboard sign that still hadn't learned how to spell croissant, past the old record store I once spent entire afternoons in, flipping through vinyl I couldn't afford. I wasn't going anywhere in particular. I just wanted to see if the world had kept spinning without me. And of course, it had. I parked 2 blocks away from my parents' house, not because I intended to stop by, but because some part of me still needed to see it, to bear witness to the place I had once called home, now stripped of the illusion. From that distance it looked the same, quiet, trimmed hedges, the same curtain askew in the front window, the porch light still on in the middle of the day. Because my father always said it deterred solicitors. But as I watched, I saw something I didn't expect. My father sitting in the chair by the window, not reading, not watching TV, just staring straight ahead. His face blank, his body motionless. I wondered what he saw. I wondered if he ever thought about that moment in the kitchen, the words he threw at me like loose change, and if he had played them back the way I had, over and over, like a song you hate but can't stop humming. I wondered if he regretted them, or if regret was simply not a language he had learned to speak. I didn't go to the door. I didn't leave a note. I sat in the car until the sun began to dip below the rooftops, casting long shadows across the pavement, and then I drove away, slower than before, as if the act of moving forward required something ceremonial. That night, back at Tara's, I told her the truth, not just about the visit, but about the feeling I couldn't shake, that I had severed something inside me that might never grow back. She listened the way she always did, without interrupting, without trying to fix anything. And when I finished, she didn't offer platitudes or cliches. She just said, "You made space where there wasn't any. That matters." I realized then that I had been waiting for an apology, not because I needed the words, but because I thought the words might unlock something in me that had been shut down for years. But the apology never came, and likely never would. And in the absence of it, I found something I hadn't expected. Freedom. Freedom from waiting, freedom from bending, freedom from the ache of trying to earn what should have been freely given. In the end, I didn't reclaim my place in his house, or his favor, or even his understanding. What I reclaimed was far more valuable: my own authority, the right to decide what I would and wouldn't carry, and the ability to walk away without looking back. And if there's a kind of revenge in that, if there's something poetic in the quiet power of choosing yourself after being told you were never enough, then I suppose this story ends not with a bang, not with reconciliation or dramatic transformation, but with a woman standing tall in her own life, no longer asking for permission to exist. And that, perhaps, is the best ending I could have written.